What happens when you take a 5.3 liter LS, run it stock, then modify it, then bore and stroke it and modify it some more? Let's find out. But you know what? Let's not stop there. Let's do the same thing to a 6 liter. In this video, we're going to take a look at both a 5.3 liter and a 6 liter LS in stock trim, in modified trim, then as a stroker and modified trim. So what happens when we go from the stock to the modified to the stroker version? Is it a good, better, best scenario? Let's find out. This is a very cool comparison because it shows what happens when you take a stock 5.3, and we're also going to do this to a 6 liter, but when you take a stock 5.3 and then modify it with heads, cam, and intake manifold, and then what happens when you step up in displacement to that similar combination with heads, cam, and intake, but with more displacement. We're going up from 324 inches or so up to 383 inches, and, you know, throwing all the bells and whistles at it, so it should be kind of cool. We're starting out with a basically junkyard LM7 5.3 liter, and all that we did, the way that we run it on the engine dynos, we put long tube headers on it. It has an open manual throttle body. It has a Holley HP management system, and it has no accessories. We obviously run it a little colder than they do stock, and we optimize the tune, which they obviously don't do in stock, and that's why this thing makes more power than the rated power output, and that varies a little bit depending on year, but the rated power output is much closer to 300 horsepower on these LM7s. But run the way that we run it in this optimized condition, it made 354 horsepower, and torque checked in at 381 foot-pounds of torque. And you can see it's not a real high RPM motor. It was designed as a truck motor, designed to have a good torque curve, which it does. It exceeded 350 foot-pounds from 2,800 all the way out to 5,300 RPM, and, you know, up over 375 for quite a way. So it did good. It's what you'd want out of a truck motor. You're not revving it out like you do an LS3. But here's what happened when we modified this version. What we did was we took the stock bottom end and left that the way that it is, but we put a good camshaft, we put ported cylinder heads, and a good intake manifold on there. And I'll show you what happened with that. So here's our modified 5.3 liter. And the first thing that you should notice is we obviously revved it out a lot farther. We went out to 6,700 or 6,800 RPM. And that's kind of where this thing wants to make power. You can see now that this thing, in modified trim, this thing makes peak torque at a higher engine speed than the stock motor made peak horsepower at. So it gives you an idea of how much we've shifted it. And we've shifted it quite a bit. In modified trim, this thing made over 500 horsepower, made 503 horsepower, and peak torque checked in at 443 foot-pounds of torque. So that's quite a bit more than the stock combination. But again, most of those gains, it didn't really start making more power than the stock combination until past 4,000 RPM. It didn't really get going until 4,500 RPM, which is kind of where you'd want to run this thing from 45 to 65, or even a little bit farther than this, because this thing doesn't look like it's slowing down. That's as high as we revved it. But here's what we did to this combination to get it to produce these kinds of power gains. We had a set of TrickFlow 215, the CNC ported 215 Gen X heads. You could also use a 205 head on this, which we've run on the small bore, and it works equally well. As a matter of fact, this is one of the few times that we ran a 215 head on it, which is sized really more for the bigger bore on an LS1, like the 3890 bore or 3900 bore. We had a good sized camshaft in this. It was a comp 281. It was the 54 469 that we run on everything. It was a 617 624 lift split, a 231 239 degree directional split. Oh, I take that back. This was the 459 camshaft and a 113 LSA. Now we also ran the 69 cam on this, and all it does is pick up a little bit more power at the top and loses a little bit more at the bottom end. Basically, the rest of the curve is identical. But we also had a really good intake manifold on this. Unlike the stock motor that had the stock early truck manifold on it, this had a fast LSXR. We've also run an LSXRT on this particular combination. We've also run the LSXR. It had a 102 millimeter throttle body. Both of these were run with 1 3/4 headers, and obviously both of them were optimized for the tune, both air, fuel, and timing. This particular combination was the motor that I ran. It was the baseline for the Big Bang 5.3 that we put twin turbos on and just started turning it up because it was a stock bottom end and we wanted to find out how much strength the stock bottom end had. We ended up making over 1,300 horsepower before we hurt something on the stock bottom end. This was a Gen 3 bottom end, and it did very well, made lots of power. But even in NA trim, if you can start out with a little more than 500 horsepower, that's kind of an impressive combination. But let's take a look at our last combination here. This is also a 5.3 or a 4.8 base motor because they have the same block. So here is our modified 383, and I have to admit this is probably the best 383 combination that I put together. It made just over 601 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 542 foot-pounds of torque. And so it had, you can see that it basically makes more power everywhere than the modified 5.3, and obviously a lot more power than the stock 5.3. And this is what you would expect. With this 383, again, we had ported heads, cam, and intake manifold. It had, this had a set of total engine airflow stage 2 CNC ported LS6 heads. So the stock 243 had taken over to the guys at Total Engine Airflow and having them do their magic on it, and it worked very well. We've run those heads in our big head test also, and they perform very well. A properly set of ported stock heads can do as well as a set of aftermarket cathedral port heads. So those do really well. This one had an LSXR intake. We also ran an LSXRT on this 383, and it did equally well. It had slightly bigger headers. It had 1 7/8 headers. It also had 172 roller rockers. It actually had the same comp cam. It had a 469 comp cam in it. And I think that this one had a flat top piston in it. So the compression would be a little bit higher on this than, because of the displacement and the flat top piston, than it would be on obviously on our stock bottom end 5.3. So it had basically more of everything. It had more displacement, it had more compression, it had good cylinder heads, comparable certainly to the 215s, and it had a good intake manifold. So adding the displacement and all of those changes really made a difference in power. As you can see, it basically just makes more power everywhere because that's what displacement does. Let's check out our 6-liter. Much like the 5.3, we compared a stock 6-liter to a modified 6-liter and then to a stroker version of the 6-liter. And this is our stock version. It was basically originally an LQ4, although in looking at the power output, we made 405 horsepower and 439 foot-pounds of torque. And looking at that, I know I put a stock camshaft in this, but it may have been an LQ4 or an LQ9 cam, which is a little bit better than the early 6-liter LQ4 camshaft. But either way, you can see, like the 5.3, this 6.0 was made for torque. It was made for towing. It was made to tow, boats and trailers and things like that. So it's designed to produce torque. It made peak power at only 5,300 RPM and peak torque at 4,300 RPM. So again, designed for kind of low speed operation. But this thing did really well. But here's what happened after we put together a modified 6-liter. And just like with the 5.3 previously, the modified 6-liter made power at a much higher RPM. In this case, we ran it out past 7,000 RPM. It made peak power at 6,900. And as with the 5.3, on the modified version, on the 6-liter, we made peak torque on the modified version at a higher RPM than the stock motor made peak horsepower. So it gives you an idea on how far we're shifting this. This thing made 505 foot-pounds of torque at 5,700 RPM. So we can take a look, and you can see it made more power than the stock one from 3,400 on up, but then the bigger, wilder cam timing probably hurt it down low just a little bit. We can take a look at our test description on our modified vehicle, or the modified motor. It was a stock block and stock crank, but it did have forged rods, Carrillo rods, and forged CP pistons. They were flat top, so this thing had more compression, obviously, than the dish piston used in the stock. And obviously, it has a smaller chamber, too. We used a set of Airflow Research LSX V2 230 heads, and they had 58 cc chambers. So this thing had quite a bit more compression than the stock one did. It also had a healthy camshaft in it. It had the Comp 469, which is a 617, 624 lift, a 231, 247 degree duration split, a 113 degree lobe separation angle. We also had a fast intake manifold on this. It was an LSXR with a 102mm throttle body and a set of 1 7/8" headers. So this combination was obviously optimized, and the power output shows. I mean, the thing made 591 horsepower and 505 foot-pounds of torque. So it did very well as a modified 6-liter, which they tend to do. And this thing is getting up near 100 horsepower per liter, which is pretty impressive. But here's what happened when we stepped up in displacement to a 408-inch stroker. And that is a stock 6-liter block with a 4-inch stroker crank. And the block is bored 30 over. This thing had forged rods and pistons in it, and along with the stroker crank. It also had a set of Airflow Research 245 heads, which in my opinion are a little too big for this combination, or more than this thing needs. It couldn't take advantage of everything that a 245 head had to flow, but they obviously allowed this thing to work. And we also had a fast LSXRT, and then we had a healthy crane cam, which was a 624 lift, a 239, 255 degree duration, and 114 degree lobe separation angle. So it had a healthy cam, it had a good intake, it had ported heads, and it had displacement. These were a dish piston, a 10cc dish piston, and not a flat top like the modified version. But as you can see, this thing made 623 horsepower, and peak torque checked in at 580 foot-pounds of torque. And you can see that this thing made peak power earlier than the 6-liter did, than the modified 6-liter, made peak torque earlier than the modified version, which has more displacement. And you can see also that it basically makes more torque everywhere compared to either one of the combinations, whether it's the stock one, obviously we would expect, and the modified 6-liter as well. So it made more power everywhere, and it would start to lose power as we rev this thing out even further. If we were to go to 7,000, we might not be carrying that thing straight across. It might start to fall off, because if you look down here near 2,500 RPM, the stroker has plenty of torque, which we would expect from the displacement. So this is what happens when you go up to a modified version, and then obviously to a modified stroker version. As you go up, everything gets better. It makes more power. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn from our experiment with the 5.3-liter and the 6-liter, going from stock motors to a modified motor to a modified stroker version? Well, we learned the following things. First of all, starting with an LS, obviously always a good idea, and a modified version of the LS is better still. And then a stroker version that's also modified is the best of all of the three. And I know that that's true. I have a 5.3 in my truck, and I've driven other 6-liter trucks. They're better. I've driven stroker versions, and they're even better still. And that's the thing that happens. And yes, I understand here, you guys can make all the comments you want right now, but why wouldn't you just put a cam and springs and put a turbo on it? That's great. And we know that that works, and you can make a zillion horsepower doing that. But not everybody wants a turbo, and for a variety of different reasons. They don't want to have the lag. They don't want to have the heat. They don't want to have to build the kit and have all of that work. There are a lot of reasons. Also, if they have a 4L60 trans, they don't want that much power going through their trans like me. I know that mine would break immediately. So not only, making 800 or 900 or 1,000 horsepower is easy with a turbo 5.3, obviously, but then you have to have a 1,000 horsepower transmission and a rear end and drive shafts and all that stuff too. So I understand the appeal of modifying your NA motor, and I also understand the appeal of doing a stroker version of that, because having lots and lots of torque when you step on the gas is always good. Armature Holder, guys, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I will keep testing.